We've used the words supply chain, value chain, and marketing channel in this class. I'm going to use the term supply chain and give you some examples. One example is going to be blueberries. So as we think about blueberries as a supply chain, so here's our classic figure. We'll talk about what's going on with blueberries. Here's the global value chain governance types. As we see what's happening with blueberries is they've quickly become a global superfood, if you will, a global antioxidant. 10 years ago, it was not common to eat blueberries globally. Today, we're finding blueberries in almost every country in the world where people are demanding these. You're going to find blueberries. During that time period, blueberries have gone from a cash basis, buying and selling based on the weight, for example, of blueberries, to some type of a lead firm with relationships. And as we're going to see here jointly, one of the biggest suppliers is what used to be called Michigan Blueberries Cooperative, but it now goes under a different name. So we're rapidly seeing a value chain, a global value chain developing for blueberries, and we're going to talk about why that is today as part of this discussion. 88% of the world's blueberries are grown in the United States and Canada. Now we're seeing plantings done all over the world. I was in Peru in the summer of 2018, and I was on some of the blueberry plantations in Chile and Peru that were being grown here. And they were not growing blueberries down there 10 years ago. Wild blueberries, or what they call low bush blueberries, are mostly from Maine and Canada. The data here we're going to talk about high bush blueberries, which are the ones that are being produced for export production and the ones you most commonly see if you were to eat these out somewhere. But wild blueberry production expansion is one of the largest contributors to global blueberry volume growth in recent years. And so they are representing more than 1/3 of our volume growth in since 2014. I'm trying to grow blueberries at my place, and it's taken a long time for them to take off. They're very complicated to grow. You've got to have a certain amount of frost-free days between 35 and 45 degrees, and so far I haven't had that yet. But I'm confident next year with the bees I've got and my pollination, that should be happening. Hopefully I'll get a bumper crop of blueberries. The berry category itself is growing worldwide, as we'll see, and there's a reputation for its nutritional benefits that are going on. Blueberries are following a similar trend to other high-value produce items in their evolution. And I got this quote from an IRI report. So typically, as we think about different ways of value chains, as we think about going back to that original thought process, those original diagrams, supply is typically supply-driven. The first stage of evolution, of global supply chains, is all driven by supply. We create production, we ensure the product's available, health claims help people drive this. Then we start to focus on quality as the industry matures. It scales up and becomes more selective, more quality-driven. Value-driven, finally the product becomes more valuable, and value creation happens because the blueberries are now being used, in this case, in many different products. And so we're seeing blueberries quickly becoming a value-driven business in a short period of time. Look what's happened to per capita consumption. So this is data from USDA, and this is pounds per capita over here. Look what's happened of the processed blueberries and fresh blueberry consumption. Literally, since 2007, we've gone through just over half a pound per person to almost 3 times that, to 1.5 pounds per person. And if you look at just the growth from 1 pound of processed and fresh blueberries, we're almost at 2.5 times that. So per capita consumption of blueberries has quickly gone increasing in the United States. And these trends you see globally. Their consumption is not as high as ours, but we're still seeing the same shape of growth globally in blueberries. Our exports are somewhat stable. Part of that is because our demand is so strong, and as we'll see here shortly, we're importing blueberries. And so we have not really started exporting blueberries in a major fashion yet. Canada is our largest export destination for fresh blueberries, and then Eastern Asian countries are becoming more and more important. But Canada remains our biggest source for our exports. However, we're seeing increase of fresh blueberries coming from Chile. So Peru's starting to grow those, but Chile in the Central Valley, south of Santiago, still remains a source of many of our fresh blueberries, and we're getting fresh grapes from down there. We're getting a number of berry crops from the Central Valley in Chile. So Chile is a major producer. The Central Valley in Chile has many of the same characteristics as the Central Valley in California, except it's in the southern hemisphere. So we produce the northern hemisphere. Our harvesting is in the fall and our planting is in the spring. It's just the opposite in Chile. So Chile can produce things and hit different slots in the U.S. Buying system so that we're able to get these crops year-round, these berry crops. We've seen almost doubling of acreage. So along with that consumption, we've seen the acreage going way up. And if you look right here, what's going on, Michigan is still a big state, but it's kind of it's not grown anywhere near like we're seeing in other states like Georgia, Oregon, and Washington State. But keep in mind, British Columbia is still the largest producer in North America. The PNW, the Pacific Northwest, and British Columbia represent 30% of global production and almost 55% of all global processing of blueberries. The newer orchards in Oregon and Washington have got greater yields, and so relative to Michigan, their yields are going up, and so as they plant new varieties and we learn more about production, those states, in this case Washington and Oregon, are growing those varieties, whereas Michigan has not grown those varieties yet. Here I've taken the ratio of fresh acreages to processing acreage, trying to understand what's going on in terms of that. So if fresh acres is equal to processing acres, we're going to be at 100%. So I want to, by making something unitless, I'm trying to understand where are we producing more processing acres versus processing and more fresh versus that. So if you look at what's going on here, in Washington State, we're producing far more processing acreages relative to Georgia, and we'll talk about why that is. So processing is something like freezing. The fresh market's got higher prices, and if I can't sell in the fresh market, then I'm going to process them in some way into cans or frozen to try to market them. If you look at the Michigan price here, we've seen some price erosion, probably caused by we're not as efficient in terms of our production, and so the price discovery process is not where in Oregon or Washington, some of those could go export, where you might be able to get some higher prices. Grower prices are here, as we see, are much higher for fresh blueberries, and I've got the Michigan, Oregon, Washington, Georgia prices shown there. If you look at what's happened, if you go back on these previous graphs, what you'll see is Georgia and Washington growers saw higher prices. As they saw higher prices, induced those farmers to grow more blueberries, expand their acreage and their yields. So part of that was driven by, as we'll see, the production. As we put assets to buy, new buyers to buy these products, prices were higher to induce them, and now we're seeing some stabilization in terms of some of these prices. So here's an IRI study I got my hands on. If you look at some of the findings, what we're seeing is demand is up for berries overall. And we're seeing the northeast part of the United States is where we're seeing a more increase in demand for berries because of their health benefits. Michigan tends to have stronger grower prices historically than Oregon and Washington, but some of that's changing, as I've talked about. Here's the weighted average of retail prices per ounce for two different sizes. So I've had to really do some digging to pull this out. But here's a 6-ounce size. We'll just go OZ there for ounces. And here's a pint, or a 16-ounce size. So this size is too big. It's twice as big as this one, or twice bigger or more. But I put them in a common denominator here, a per ounce size. So the smaller package has got a higher price per ounce than the bigger package, and that stands to reason. Typically, of volume discounts, if you will, the bigger the package, the price per unit is oftentimes smaller. Here's just more showing how the average prices are going up for blueberries. Here I've put together a supply curve. So I've taken the pounds per acre as a measure of yield. And I've taken the value of production utilized by pounds there, and I've tried to grow some type of supply curve. And so I've got this should be price, I see, a weighted price. And so I've got some type of a supply curve there. Now it's slightly inverted, it's very elastic, but I've got the type of supply curve that I want for blueberries. What happens here is with blueberries, here I've got monthly data. As you see, what happens is during the marketing year in the fall, I have large volumes of inventories. As the marketing year progresses, the stocks are drawn down. They're processed, they're sold as fresh, and then the new marketing year starts. And see, as you see, what's going on is we've seen a gradual inventory buildup. So these inventories are growing up over time, which suggests that supply of blueberries is slowly growing faster than demand. So some of that Georgia, Washington, Oregon inventory is growing a little quicker with these new varieties than what the demand is growing in the United States. What do we know about blueberries? High bush blueberries, like acidic soils and water, they grow about 6 feet high. Typically, they're a white blossom. They have to be bee pollinated. We've typically got to pick these by hand. And there's some research done at the University of California, Berkeley, talking about how these folks are paid. We really don't see much mechanical harvestation right now. It's very difficult to have these tree shakers or bush shakers, and so it's still very much a hand-picked business. And with some of the immigration issues we're dealing with and worker visas, this is becoming more and more of a concern. What you see is, as the supply chain is evolving, we have new varieties. So if you look here at the University of Minnesota, we've got a number of varieties that we're producing. We have private varieties going out to Northwest growers. And so sometimes these are sold, certain type of varieties are only available and then they're all used up. No one else can use those varieties. And so typically what's going on is we've seen this in apples, where Honeycrisp apples anybody can grow, but there's other type of apple varieties that only certain people are allowed to grow those. And once that supply is set up, no one else can grow those varieties. And the reason for that is more and more as consumers go through the produce part of the grocery store, they're increasingly starting to buy things based on their variety name. So Fuji apples are now the number one type of apple. 40 years ago, everybody just bought an apple, and the odds are it was a Red Delicious apple. Fuji apples are now selling faster than Delicious apples, and Honeycrisp will displace Red Delicious apples here in the near future. Grapes, people buy grapes by variety. People are now looking at blueberries possibly and buying them by variety. And so what's going on is the pricing system is changing to reflect the fact that growers are want to get rid of all their blueberries, if you will, at harvest, but the packers who are buying those blueberries are unwilling to buy all of those blueberries at harvest because they're not sure if they can do all those. And so we're going to see more consolidation, and that's why that supply chain is going to move, the value chain is going to move to the right like we saw in our diagram early in this presentation. Let's look real quick at the types of berries: blackberries, boysenberries, loganberries, black raspberries, red raspberries, cranberries, and strawberries. What do we know about the price relationship between all these different berries? They're very close, so there's high correlation among all these. We're seeing emerging markets like fresh blackberries. It's very uncommon to get blackberries 15 years ago. And so we're seeing an increase in all of these berries. A lot of consumers are not loyal when it comes to berry. They typically just want a cup of berries, and so it's not going to matter so much what they are. Blackberries are becoming more sensitive priced right now because we're seeing more and more other types of berries, and they're now emerging as a year-round type crop. And people are really loyal, though, to strawberries and blueberries, so they're less responsive to changes in substitute prices. Here's the dollars and pounds. I've pulled this data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I've got strawberries, Oregon blackberries, Oregon boysenberries, black raspberries, red raspberries, California raspberries, and Oregon raspberries. As you can see, what's happened here, we see the California red raspberries taken off a little bit in price. We're seeing some of the Oregon black raspberries have a higher price, but these prices all pretty much track each other very closely. The IRI study identified 7 macro trends for berry consumption, and more particular blueberry consumption. We're seeing these becoming a global fruit. We're now seeing reliable supply coming from Washington and Peru and other places. We're starting to move into these closed varieties, only a certain amount of varieties that I talked about being grown. We're seeing some outside capital, some people move in here and putting up blueberry orchards, private equity firms that saw the higher prices. The processed market for frozen or canned blueberries, again, we've got some issues going on there, which I'll talk about, and we're seeing a number of more and more price competition happening. So one of the largest buyers of blueberries used to be called Michigan Blueberry Growing Cooperative. They've now joined with several other large owners and created something called Nature Ripe to do a more collective berry production. And what they've got is they've got a big, huge bucket of blueberries beyond just what Michigan Blueberries had. Michigan Blueberries had these states right here. And now we've got Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and California that are all being sold through this new Nature Ripe. And so what they're doing is they are now developing a large volume and becoming reliable suppliers, just like that value chain talked about. And in doing so, they're able to pass along volume premiums to their growers. We're seeing ready-to-eat, extended shelf life blueberries coming out, which require different types of packaging. And so as part of that process of trying to extend the shelf life of blueberries, especially when they're going overseas, what can we do to do that and transport these in Eastern countries and in Europe? So if you think about what's happening with blueberries right now, it's rapidly moving from a cash market 15 years ago to more and more of a value chain supply market as it tries to take care of what's going on globally. And that's happened in a relatively short period of time, and we've seen the same thing happen to strawberries and raspberries and other fruits. So here's an example of a market that 15 years ago you knew very little about, but today everybody wants blueberries year-round.